Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Academic Librarianship Today, which is sponsored by Rowman and Littlefield. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you will see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can click the buttons across the top of the screen in the upper right corner to activate the panels. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions to our speakers. At the end of the presentation, a few minutes to answer your questions, so please do send them in throughout. If you experience any technical issues, please use the chat panel to let me know, and I'll troubleshoot the issue with you privately. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars during and after this event. So if you have another screen handy, feel free to shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered will receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. I would also like to mention that if folks are interested in any of the topics presented today, they can find more discussion in the volume Academic Librarianship Today, available from Rowman and Littlefield. Use the promo code ALT30 for 30% off your order at Rowman.com. All right, our host today is Todd Gilman, and I will turn it over to him to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Mark. We're speaking to the topics addressed in my recent edited volume, Academic Librarianship Today, published by Rowman and Littlefield in February. This new collection of contributed chapters, none previously published, offers 20 experts' perspectives on the transformation of academic libraries as information organizations, especially the influence of technology on how we provide academic information resources and services in a digital and global environment, and the various career opportunities available for academic librarians today and tomorrow. At the end of each chapter, the authors offer a series of questions for discussion and one or more assignments to stimulate thought, reinforce comprehension of the chapter's content, and provide a means of applying the knowledge gained. So the book can be used as a textbook for library and information studies courses or as just engaging professional reading for working librarians of all stripes. The book is comprised of 3 parts. Part 1, the academic library landscape today, introduces the subject, beginning with Deanna Markham's essay, placing U.S. academic librarianship in its historic context and identifying the most pressing issues we face, particularly financial and technological challenges. Markham describes how the unprecedented and underestimated influx of veterans of World War II into U.S. colleges and universities propelled the first great academic library expansion the country was to witness, how computer technology simultaneously revolutionized these libraries, and how the growth of the Internet and World Wide Web later brought about another sea change, in part by enabling the large-scale conversion of analog material to digital format. Yet she also explores the legal complications this conversion brought about, especially the Google Books initiative and subsequent developments such as the Digital Public Library of America. She concludes with a discussion of the unsustainable financial pressures libraries have experienced as a result of the explosion of research materials now available in all disciplines, particularly electronic journals and the hard sciences, and how this pressure has led to urgent efforts to share journals and books among library consortia, which is just a fancy word for regional partnerships among libraries, and to make as many of these resources as possible available via open access, free to all. Barbara Dewey's chapter on governance outlines how academic libraries fit within their parent institutions of higher education and how libraries strive to align themselves with the university's mission, vision, value, and academic culture. Star Hoffman's chapter on organization, administration, management, and planning focuses on how academic librarians' roles have been defined within the library, typical duties of administrators and managers, and how all cooperate to ensure successful innovation by means of strategic planning. Tahir Rau's chapter on funding and budgeting describes the various sources of library funds and how budgets for collections, services, and facilities are planned and implemented. Sarah and Joan Lippencott's chapter, addressing faculty and scholarly communication, describes the influence of teaching faculty, who need to be productive scholars creating new knowledge, on the priorities of their libraries. It also explores the current crisis in academic publishing. And we'll be hearing from Sarah Lippencott in a few moments. The second section, Academic Librarians and Services Today, focuses on personnel and their roles serving students, faculty, and staff. This section begins with the topic of public services, which spans 2 chapters. The first chapter is devoted to reference, instruction, outreach to faculty and students, and faculty-librarian collaboration. The second chapter concerns collection development, circulation, and resource sharing. The chapter on reference, information, and outreach, faculty-librarian collaboration, by Carrie Forbes and Peggy Kieran, details current thinking on best practices, including service models such as library liaisons to academic departments and so-called embedded librarianship. Forbes and Kieran also introduce pedagogic methods and instructional technology designed both to improve students' information literacy by emphasizing critical thinking and active learning and to accommodate different learning styles. We'll hear from Carrie Forbes after Sarah Lippencott's presentation. The chapter on collection development by Lydia Uziel concerns general collections as well as special collections and archives, in both print and electronic formats. Lydia also considers changing staff roles in access services and recent consortial lending partnerships that emphasize access over ownership of library materials. This leads naturally to Autumn Faulkner's chapter on technical services, which examines current challenges facing cataloging, metadata, systems, electronic resource management, resource discoverability, and the changing roles of professionals. Faulkner emphasizes technical services for general collections, but also touches on issues unique to rare book and manuscript specialists and archivists. So as not to overemphasize large university libraries, despite the cover showing Sterling Memorial Library and Beinecke Library at Yale University, where I work, Zoe Fisher and Kim Reed devote a chapter to librarians and services in four-year college and community college libraries and how they meet the needs of somewhat different populations and thus face unique challenges. The third and final section, entitled Changing Priorities, New Directions, emphasizes topics at the forefront of academic libraries in the digital age. This section opens with Marta Brunner and Jennifer Osorio's chapter discussing the recruitment, retention, and supervision of academic library staff, especially appropriate educational requirements for professional and paraprofessional employees, and the need for greater emphasis on diversity, mentorship, and professional development. Brunner and Osorio also discuss the challenges of working in union environments, of training and retaining student workers, and handling and disciplining underperforming employees. We'll hear from Jennifer Osorio after Carrie Forbes' presentation. Then comes David Lewis's chapter on physical and virtual library spatial design. Lewis details how rethinking and configuring library spaces such as learning commons and smart classrooms actually and potentially affect teaching, learning, and research today and in the future. Debbie Ferris's chapter on serving both campus and remote users acknowledges the increasing need to accommodate people where they are, including students learning online who may be on campus or hundreds or even thousands of miles away, and the faculty who seek to reach them in technologically sophisticated ways. In the next chapter, Brian Owen focuses on the newest means of access to and security of scholarship and raw data, open access, institutional repositories, e-science and digital curation, including digital humanities, and digital preservation. Issues of copyright and fair use also figure in Owen's chapter, and Brian is the last of today's presenters. We'll hear from him after Jennifer Osorio finishes. Nisa Bakalbatsi's chapter on assessment, promotion, and marketing of academic libraries acknowledges the need for these libraries to be accountable to their stakeholders in measurable ways as never before, and explores ways we can increase the number of our users in order to remain relevant on our campuses. The book ends with Ronald Jance's consideration of a number of possible new roles for academic librarians of the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd, for that introduction to the volume. I'm Sarah Lippincott, formerly of the Library Publishing Coalition, a nonprofit membership association for libraries who are engaged in publishing. I'm currently an independent scholarly communications and digital scholarship consultant. My latest project has been working with the Harvard Library to develop a strategy for enhancing digital scholarship services in the library. I co-wrote this chapter with Joan Lippincott, Associate Executive Director of the Coalition for Networked Information. Our chapter introduces readers to the fundamental concepts of faculty research expectations in various disciplines and institutional contexts, and how that research is published and evaluated. We talk about the differences in research and publication expectations for humanists versus social scientists versus hard scientists, for example, and the differences in research expectations between large research-intensive universities and liberal arts colleges. And we talk about the many ways that that research is then disseminated, whether through traditional commercially published monographs or journals, through university presses, or increasingly through other open access and other non-traditional channels for dissemination. We frame the chapter around a discussion of major points of contention in scholarly communication and address how librarians participate in scholarly communications as collectors and curators of published and unpublished research, as authors themselves, and as advocates for transformations in publishing, and increasingly as publishers as well. We also give readers an overview of the publishing process, from manuscript submission through peer review and publication, and we discuss the challenges and conflicts that emerge at each stage of that process. For example, we talk in depth about the significance of peer review, including the shortcomings of blind peer review, and alternative forms of evaluation of scholarship. We provide an overview of the serials crisis and skyrocketing subscription costs, and how this and other perceived flaws in the current publishing system have contributed to the rise of the open access movement and alternative publishing models. Finally, we discuss libraries as publishers, including library collaboration with university presses, and other ways in which libraries are actually becoming disseminators of their own unique content. In this presentation, I want to highlight a few of the discussion questions that we pose to readers at the end of our chapter, which illuminate some of the issues that we engage with in depth. In addition to providing a basic introduction to the history and practice of scholarly communication, our chapter primarily seeks to answer this fundamental question. How are libraries and librarians reacting and contributing to a rapidly changing scholarly communication environment? Many academic libraries, from large research institutions to liberal arts colleges, now have dedicated scholarly communication librarians who may manage the institutional repository where faculty can deposit their research outputs. They may offer copyright and fair use guidance and other forms of counseling for scholars in their role as authors, and perform other functions, including increasing awareness of open access or other scholarly communications issues on campus. But they're far from the only ones who engage with the products and processes of scholarly communication on a daily basis. Bibliographers and liaisons possess and develop an in-depth knowledge of the publishing landscape in various disciplines. E-resources managers are acutely aware of the implications of escalating costs of commercially published content and work with and engage in that tension on a daily basis. Catalogers are increasingly charged with ensuring that open access and non-traditional content appears in library discovery systems. And reference and instruction librarians increasingly acknowledge that an understanding of scholarly communication is a fundamental component of information literacy for undergraduates and especially, certainly for graduate students who will become authors themselves. And this has been a major area of expansion in the thinking around information literacy is connecting an understanding of evaluating information and finding information with an understanding of how that information makes it into the library in the first place, an understanding of the systems, the processes, and in some instances, the biases or the flaws in the way that scholarship moves through the pipeline and reaches the consumer. This is it's clear how this relates to the other ways in which we talk about information literacy and evaluating sources with our constituents. We also spend a good deal of time in our chapter discussing new forms of content and their implications for scholars and librarians. We ask our readers to consider several interrelated questions. For example, are the current methods of evaluating faculty research output fair? And what are the promises and potential pitfalls of alternatives such as altmetrics? We also ask how data sets, digital humanity projects, and other new forms of scholarship change the equations in scholarly publishing and faculty review. Monographs and journals remain the mainstays of scholarly literature. It's still what most scholars must produce to establish their reputations and succeed in tenure and promotion processes. However, we have also seen an explosion in new types of content, from gray literature like technical reports and conference proceedings to sophisticated multimedia content and digital humanities projects. All of these new types of media are increasingly considered part of the scholar's core output and therefore part of the library's core collection. It is also often unique content that may only exist in one institution's institutional repository, and therefore can become an important and distinctive part of the library's collection. The explosion of these new types of content have implications for the library's digital infrastructure, and you can see that demonstrated in how many libraries, including smaller liberal arts colleges, have institutional repositories, and the importance of building that kind of digital infrastructure. It also has implications for discovery systems and for reference and instruction in terms of how these new types of content are curated and managed. And finally, it has implications for how scholarly work is evaluated, specifically for tenure and promotion purposes. And the challenge of figuring out how data sets or digital humanities projects should count in tenure and promotion processes has helped shine a spotlight on these current methods of evaluating scholarship, like the impact factor, that increasingly seems like a poor surrogate for measuring high-quality, significant scholarship, and seems to perpetuate some of these systemic biases. For example, the discrepancies you see in high prestige journals in terms of the author demographics. Our chapter discusses this issue broadly and specifically examines altmetrics, which aim to broaden the definition of scholarly impact by taking into account not only citations and the prestige of the press or publication, but also the reception of the research in news and social media, the number of views or downloads it receives, and other metrics of actual engagement with the scholarship. We also ask our readers to think about the process of peer review, which has also come under increasing scrutiny, and the efficacy and value of current methods of peer review, specifically the strengths and weaknesses of blind peer review and the possibility of open or crowdsourced peer review as an alternative. Again, blind peer review has been seen to perpetuate some of these same kinds of biases that we see in the literature in terms of demographics, in terms of reinforcing currently held beliefs, and these other kinds of systemic biases that occur in the literature. So we talk about some of the alternatives, how open peer review might help to eliminate some of those kinds of biases in the literature. And finally, we talk about how libraries are actively engaging in transforming the scholarly communication system, not only in terms of the ways in which they're curating resources in the library, curating and collecting resources and advising scholars, but as publishers themselves. Libraries are increasingly adopting the role of publisher. The Library Publishing Coalition counts over 120 libraries with publishing programs in the latest edition of their library publishing directory. In some cases, this means a library is actually establishing a university press. In some cases, it is working with an existing university press on campus with a formal administrative relationship or with more informal partnerships. And in some cases, it might be more of a journal publishing or a journal hosting platform, for example, through the institutional repository. Most of these library publishing programs are open access, and many of them focus on these new forms of media, whether that's gray literature or multimedia, digital humanities projects. And so libraries are really working on the cutting edge of these transformations in scholarly communication by directly participating as publishers and working directly with scholars on their campuses to meet 21st century scholarly needs. I think an understanding of scholarly communication is one of the most important emerging knowledge sets for librarians across the institution for all of the reasons that I've mentioned. I think it's an understanding of these different challenges and the context of scholarly publishing helps librarians in all roles in the institution help their constituents and work towards a healthier scholarly publishing ecosystem. So I thank you for your time, and I hope that you'll check out our chapter if any of these issues have piqued your interest.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. My name is Carrie Forbes, and I'm the Associate Dean at the University of Denver, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you today about current methods and models of reference instruction in outreach, which is the chapter that I co-wrote with my colleague Peggy Kieran, who's the Arts and Humanities Reference Librarian at the University of Denver. Since we have limited time today, I won't be going into any depth about particular models, but instead I hope to highlight some key trends within reference and instruction. To begin our discussion on reference and instruction models, I'd first like to talk a little bit about the changing role of the liaison, which is also something that you'll hear in the presentations coming after me as well. In an Association of Research Libraries report in August 2013 titled New Roles for New Times, Transforming Liaison Roles in Research Libraries, the authors note that the role of the liaison has shifted from focusing on what librarians do to what users do. And I should just add that even though that report is focused on research libraries, there is a lot of material in there that's very applicable to libraries of all sizes. This user-centered focus permeates the majority of discussions on current reference and instruction models. And due to this student-centered focus, we have seen a shift in the responsibilities of liaison librarians from more traditional roles to evolving roles encompassing more campus engagement and outreach. Some libraries have even moved away from subject specialists, subject bibliographers completely, embracing a more functional approach to liaison services. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the three models that we're generally seeing across academic libraries. The traditional liaison role is still very popular, though this role has not waned. The focus has certainly shifted. It's more emphasis on instruction and personalized services, whether that's consultations or personalized librarian services, and less collection development. That collection development expertise is now being used in curriculum development work, and I think we'll see the shift continue as well as more and more demand-driven, patron-driven acquisitions comes on board. The evolving role with campus engagement, liaison librarians are increasingly part of the outreach. So many librarians do have an outreach librarian as well, but the subject librarians are really taking on an advocacy or ambassador role for student and faculty needs. As consultants or experts in a certain subject area, they're often paired with functional specialists. So functional specialists would be an outreach coordinator, instruction coordinator, distance education, user design, those kinds of positions in libraries as opposed to a more traditional subject reference librarian. And that pairing allows the library to provide more services for students. And then again, librarians are also taking on increasing outreach roles, serving as a bridge between the community and library services and resources. And with all of these models, the goal is really to actively educate rather than to passively wait. So librarians, however they're engaged, are integrating themselves in all areas of the campus rather than waiting for people to come to the library. As the teaching aspect of academic librarianship has grown, reference models have also evolved to better meet the needs of a diverse array of students. While what you would think of as ready reference, answering sort of quick questions, is not as common as it once was, students and faculty still need and will likely need for the foreseeable future assistance with developing complex search strategies, evaluating information, finding in-depth information, especially specialized information, data sets, white papers, conference proceedings, those types of things. Most reference or information desks still see a large number of directional questions, but ready reference questions have largely been replaced by research consultations. And many academic libraries of all sizes have implemented various reference models to meet the needs of the community. And we really stress in our chapter that there is no one reference model that meets the needs of every academic community, that reference librarians and administrators really need to take into consideration the types of services that would most benefit their community. So reference desks are still very common. It does seem like we've been talking about what is happening to the reference desk for decades now, but reference desks are still very, very common across the spectrum of academic libraries. They are increasingly, however, being replaced with information desks that are staffed by paraprofessionals or students. In the picture that you see on this slide, this is the research center at the University of Denver where Peggy and I work, and we have an information desk that's staffed solely by graduate students, and then the reference librarians are not at the desk. They're actually in this consultation room where they do one-on-one consultations with students or faculty. And the research consultation model is becoming increasingly common as well, whether they do it in a center, such as we have here in this picture, or they do it in their offices. And then single service points are also common, where they are staffing circulation, technology help, and reference help all at the same desk, and then referring for consultations if students have more in-depth questions. Personal and roving reference. So roving reference has been around for a long time, but that is increasingly referring to setting up consultation areas in other remote locations. So a liaison librarian might go to the building where their faculty and students are primarily located to offer services there. The personal librarian model is also becoming common, where instead of just a general liaison librarian where you're attached to a subject area, you might actually be a dedicated advisor for a student. So a student has a certain librarian that they contact for help regardless of their subject area. And then we will talk about embedded models a little more, and this is also something that you'll see throughout the rest of the presentations. Embedded models are where librarians are fully immersed in a class or a department, and they provide research support as well as co-teaching with a faculty member. And this is both online as well as in person. And lastly, I would like to talk a little bit about information literacy instruction. So curricular changes in higher education, focusing on interdisciplinarity, accountability, and student learning, have prompted academic librarians to rebrand their programmatic efforts with information literacy rather than traditional one-shot sessions. Librarians at many types of higher education institutions are now focusing on collaborating with faculty to develop thoughtful assignments and provide online instructional materials that are built into key courses within the curriculum. The new ACRL framework, as well as growing literature on critical information literacy pedagogy, means that librarians now increasingly have the skill set needed to really fully work with faculty and the disciplines to do this kind of curriculum work. And based on the services trends in ARL libraries, so this graph that you see in front of you, I know it's kind of hard to see. This is looking at sort of overall service trends, and so the light green line is the number of group presentations, and the red line is the number of students in presentations, and the very, very bottom line is reference transactions. So reference transactions have been declining for a number of years, while instruction has been growing. And I think this is part of a larger trend in higher education as well, where it's not so much that reference is going away as much as that it's being embedded into instructional and embedded services that librarians are providing. And you're seeing this trend across higher education as well, where the formal curriculum is being more aligned with the co-curriculum, such as writing centers and student life being more integrated into services. So like most trends in reference and instruction, the main concern remains how libraries can provide increasingly specialized services with shrinking staff. And then in conclusion, looking at reference and instruction, there's always really been a fine line between reference instruction and outreach services. As higher education structures and student populations change, reference and instruction librarians can play a key role in helping to not only support but define student learning outcomes and curriculum. As a profession on the front lines of changing information technology, we have a lot of expertise to offer in how to use new tools to best support students and faculty. The library field has always had a strong focus on service, and this focus will help us make the case for academic libraries in higher education. But we must improve our knowledge of assessment and continually redefine our services in order to make the most meaningful impact. And new roles in research services, digital humanities, digital scholarship, scholarly communications, a lot of things you'll hear about in the other discussions, offer powerful opportunities to reshape reference and instruction to better serve our community. Thank you for your time. I will now turn it over to Jennifer Osorio.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here. My name is Jennifer Osorio, and I'm the Interim Head of International Studies at UCLA, and I co-wrote this chapter with my former colleague, Marta Brunner, who is now the college librarian at Skidmore. So she's not here today, but I'm going to try and present what we wrote for you. I'm going to give a summation of what is the current status quo in libraries as far as recruitment, retention, diversity, and professional development. Basically, that our core values and practices remain the same, that constant technological innovation is a part of the profession and continues to be and always has been a part of the profession, that we need to continue meeting user expectations, which sometimes differ from where the library is or where the library is headed. We have user expectations that rely on some traditional services, but also expect us to be providing newer services. On the blurring of the line between professionals and paraprofessionals, and another debate that's a constant in our profession, the tenure versus non-tenure debate. And then we talk also about the things that are changing, which is a much longer list and a list of things that are coming up on the horizon, including new directions in all sorts of areas, data management, mobile environments, digital scholarship, broadening scopes of scholarship. We're seeing a lot of work, more work on primary sources and digital archives, a need to understand big data and how we archive it and how we service our users for it. New digital tools that our users are coming to us for and that are changing constantly. Changing description tools beyond MARC, RDA, Ferber, other non-MARC schemas. As my previous presenter talked about, an evolving models in outreach, embedded librarianships, change in pedagogy, new curatorial activities, data analysis, crowdsourcing, digital preservation, and structural changes, a change in how we structure libraries, more cross-departmental positions that serve two different functions in two different departments that are complementary, increase in the need for computer skills beyond the traditional sort of Word, Excel paradigm, and an increase in specialization too. We talk also about professional development. This is an example of a more formal setting for professional development, but there are also informal settings in which you can develop your skills, the importance of mentoring, but also about how too often our institutions aren't supporting mentoring and aren't providing the right framework for it, the gaps in expectations between new librarians and administrative librarians, or higher ups, as we sometimes call them. Diversity, the need to move beyond traditional categories of gender, race, and ethnicity, and how we do that and how we acknowledge that need for diversity. The high contextual needs of different parts of the field. I saw somebody in the Q&A asking what skills are needed for librarians presently, and that's the really tough question. It's a highly contextual field where your skills are going to depend very much on where you are, what kind of library you're working in, what kind of job you have. We have some general sort of ideas in the chapter about it, but it's going to be very dependent on what kind of work you're doing within the library. The continual process of change and developing your skills and how you don't stop at the MLS. And then also about the need for the support of paraprofessional staff and how we continue to develop their skills and provide avenues for advancement for paraprofessionals. We're going to talk a little bit about recruitment and retention. The profession remains stubbornly homogeneous, as demonstrated by these next two charts. This one is a chart of the number of MLS degrees awarded in 1991, non-minority in yellow, minority in green, and you'll see a small increase in non-minority in 2001, or in minority, I should say. But then when you look in comparison to the population in general, you'll see this is from census numbers for about the same time period. The number of minorities increased a lot more between those 10 years, and it's much different from the numbers within the profession. And then we talk about recruitment, retention, and diversity, and about the reasons why some of those efforts have failed and why those numbers haven't really budged as far as diversity within the profession very much, about issues that we have with data collection and how we quantify diversity numbers, how we address organizational issues, including implicit bias and microaggressions, how we deal with issues of visibility and pay. We propose a few possible solutions dealing with how we gather data and develop strategies, about the possibility of a public awareness campaigns, and one of the examples that we use is a public awareness campaigns that nurses did to develop their profession and to recruit a more diverse workforce, and also more critical inquiry into attitudes and behaviors and how we influence those within the profession. And in conclusion, I would just say that, as I said before, library roles are shifting from really rigid track to more functional ones that are highly dependent on all sorts of different contexts for the skills and for the functions that you do, and depending on the need of the organization. So your skills will be very dependent on what role you fill within the organization and what the organization needs. About how library school programs may not be preparing students for these new roles and how we need to address that within the profession. And then we suggest that what library leaders really need to be focusing on beyond specifics is an increase in their staff's ability to adapt and change and be able to handle all the different changes that are coming down the road for libraries. And with that, I hand it over to my colleague Brian, who's going to talk next.
Thanks, Jennifer. My name is Brian Owen. I have a day job as the Associate Dean of Libraries at Simon Fraser University for Technology Services and Special Collections. But I'm also the Managing Director for the Public Knowledge Project, or PKP, which produces open source software such as Open Journal Systems, or OJS, that many libraries are now using for journal hosting and related scholarly communication support. I'm going to talk about three themes here that all of our previous panelists have touched on: technology, roles, and openness. And in some ways, if I just look at my sort of current setting at Simon Fraser University, we're a mid-sized, comprehensive university way up here in British Columbia in Canada. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary a year or two ago. We're not an ARL library or a big site, but the key thing that I think it reflects when we talk about technology and its impact on libraries is it has really leveled the playing field, and it doesn't necessarily require being a large, library to use technology. There's a lot of exciting and innovative things that happen with libraries that are small, in colleges, all sorts of things that do not necessarily fit into the traditional view of a big academic library. And the fact that I also spent a lot of time working on something that's closely related to the library but completely different really speaks to the changing roles for academic librarians particularly. Many of us are going to find ourselves working in very different areas than the typical library services. Now, I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to maybe talk very quickly and perhaps try to talk about technology and do a whirlwind tour of technology in libraries for the last 100 years. I'll see if I can do it in 100 seconds. And maybe I'll start by just focusing in on the concept of big data. And I think most of you are probably familiar with big data, but it also reflects that many of our users, our researchers, are changing the way they do their teaching, their research. And they've now moved into what's often described as data intensive, and that they're using data in digital form. They're using high-performance computing resources to identify, track, massage, analyze that data. But if we go back 100 years and we want to talk about big data, say circa 1925, how was really represented by the academic library on campus. This was the pre-computer age, as there was data in large, massive forms that was being stored in the academic library. Similarly, we were talking about ways that we were organizing, describing, accessing, preserving, making that data available. It was through now somewhat quaint and rather outdated mechanisms like the library card catalog. That's just a point I want to make, is that when we talk about big data, this was something that libraries have been in the business for many times. Let's fast forward now to 1975. This is when we're entering the sort of the earliest period of the computer age, especially in academic campuses, where mainframe computers were starting to become widely used. But even then, big data was quite primitive. That's a rather poorly sort of formatted picture there of a library or of a punch card, an 80-column fixed format way of describing or encoding information that could then be processed by a large mainframe computer. But if we look at what was happening in libraries in circa 1925, and we're talking about big data, This was when the machine-readable cataloging record was first appearing. And compared to what was happening in just about every other academic area, to be using a record that often was over 750 characters in length, it had fixed fields, it had variable length fields, it had repeating fields, that was a whole different type of arranging and organizing data in the library. It was also significant because it was really where we started to see some very significant shifts happening in how libraries were adopting technology. Primarily through the 70s and into the 1980s, libraries were automating, in a very industrial sense, all of their workflows and their processes. Our cataloging, our acquisitions, our serials areas were now using automated systems. The front-facing systems like library circulation were now based on, again, using a library system. This was the heyday or the appearance of the integrated library systems. We moved into the late 1980s. That was when we saw the first appearance of what we called online public access catalogs, or OPACs, and terminals or workstations that were used to put those out as a way that users accessed our resources. Through the 90s, we saw more of that happen. We started seeing significant shifts in how we were collecting materials, and all of a sudden we were collecting e-resources, e-journals, and we were providing them in an online context, not in a more traditional sort of library stack context. As we moved into this current century, what we've also seen now is other things happening in libraries where we're using technology to undertake massive digitization projects. We're actually working with big data in a direct way to look at how one manages that data and even preserves it for the long haul. And this is really just to provide background to how now we've seen, I think, roles for librarians change, particularly in the last 20, 30 years. But the one key point I want to make is that these aren't necessarily new roles. We're really just coming into roles that in many ways we were already doing for at least the past 100 years. And the foundations we have there are represented by things like our expertise with bibliographic description and metadata and the taxonomies or ontologies we need to use. We have extensive familiarity and, more important, comfort with computer infrastructure, software, and the ways that you massage and access and use machine-readable data. Through our experience with digitization, we've now got a lot of experience with how you digitize content and how you describe it, how you manage and ultimately curate it. In a lot of ways, this is talking about life cycles of data or content, and I think it's something that comes naturally to librarianship and something that we've already just had as a key component of what we do. But closely related to that, too, is that there's a long tradition of just collaborative activities. Whether we talk about library consortia or shared projects, librarians have been very good at that activity. And what it already means is that what started happening, especially in the last decade, is where we're seeing, I think, overall a shift from a passive and reactive service culture, and this permeates all parts of the library, to where we're suddenly becoming much more proactive, where we're often working directly with researchers, with students in classrooms. Several of the earlier panelists talked about how we see librarians becoming embedded on research projects, for example. The other thing it resembles, too, is that we're no longer just collecting materials. In many ways, we're directly involved in creating that material or working closely with the academics, the researchers, the students that are creating it to ensure that we can pull it in and preserve it or make it available and accessible to others out there. If there's any way just to summarize all of this, in many ways, we're moving upstream in terms of the roles we're taking on, the ways that we're getting involved with our user communities, the fact that we're working much more directly, often at a peer level with faculty. I'm conscious of time here, and I know we want to leave some time for questions, so the final thing I just want to touch on wrapping up is just the whole concept of openness. And openness has many manifestations. SPARC, the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, recognized this recently, where they realized we're not just talking about open access anymore, but it's open data, it's open education. I'd also put forward, too, that it has to deal with open source software. And that's a community that we've learned a lot from in the library world and how we apply the ways that they build community, the way that they use open resources to sort of for the greater good. Just, and I'm sure many of you have seen this because probably it's open access is the one area that's resonated most significantly with libraries. And that's the whole concept of making information readily and freely available in a technology-based way on the internet there, and that there's no barriers there, that any user has access to it. And just my final slide there that I just want to touch on in terms of libraries and openness. Again, this resonates with traditional library values. What have public libraries been about for hundreds of years? What are academic libraries also equally involved in is that, we have an interest in making knowledge, information as openly and readily available. Where it's different now is so much of that is being driven by technology, and with our familiarity and comfort with technology, it positions libraries to be key leaders in that. It really does amplify a lot of the new roles that librarians are undertaking, but perhaps most importantly, it goes back to the whole heart of what libraries are about in terms of collecting, providing access to content, creating it, and preserving it for the long haul. This really is an important new model and how we're ensuring that as many people as possible have access to that. So thank you for your time. Mark, I'm going to turn it back over to you as our MC.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to each of our presenters today, to Todd and Sarah and Carrie and Jennifer as well. We have about 10 minutes left in the hour here, and we've gotten plenty of great questions in through the Q&A. If you have additional questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A module, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. So looking through the list of questions, we have one here from Laura, and Laura says, how have libraries and librarians engaged with deans and other non-library faculty administrators regarding conversations about altmetrics and evaluation of DH data? And I'm not sure exactly what DH data is standing for, but I think that came up during your presentation, Sarah. Do you feel that you can address that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and I'll put in the Q&A a link to one article that I think does a good job of that's a good case study of how IUPUI has done this, basically advocating for a more open policy regarding open access publications and non-traditional types of publication, but effectively the library can't do anything, I don't think, on its own to influence those discussions. It goes back to making sure that the library is involved in faculty governance, finding opportunities to work directly with faculty, to be on university or college task forces or committees that make decisions or that make recommendations about tenure and promotion, and to encourage the adoption of guidelines that have been produced by some of the major scholarly societies, like the Modern Language Association, which has for many years had guidelines for evaluating digital work in digital humanities and digital media, or other societies like the College Art Association and the Society of Architectural Historians received a Mellon grant to develop guidelines for evaluation of digital scholarship, specifically in art and architectural history. So looking at the guidelines that already exist and helping to encourage adoption of those through participation in faculty governance, I think is the way that librarians can really have an influence here, and of course just raising awareness through talking with faculty about these kinds of matters, making sure that they're aware that these guidelines exist.
Great, thank you. We've got another question here from Robert, and Robert asks, when researching the concept of embedded librarianship programs in academic libraries, did you focus on all academic institutions or various levels and types? Did you find any differences between the types, for instance, graduate level institutions as opposed to like a junior college or a baccalaureate college? And I'm not sure exactly which presentation that came up during. I think perhaps Carrie or Jennifer's.
I would be happy to start, and then if Jennifer wants to add anything, that would be great. When we talked about reference and instruction models and talked about embedded librarianship, we did discuss a little bit about where, what types of institutions embedded librarianship tends to be taking place. I would say that embedded librarianship takes an incredible amount of time. It's a very time-intensive process. So they tend to be occurring in two types of libraries, mainly from what we saw. So they're either occurring at sort of small liberal arts colleges where the librarians perhaps a little bit of a smaller school where they have a lot of interaction and are really embedded into different classes, or larger sort of research institutions that may have a larger number of liaison librarians where they can really spend that kind of time. I do think it's pretty difficult at community colleges or sort of medium-sized libraries. If you have like one humanities librarian or one social science librarian, this type of work becomes a bit more difficult just because of the intensive nature of it. So that's generally what we tended to find from our research.
Hi, this is Jennifer. That wasn't really a part of our chapter very much. We took a much higher level view of job listings and descriptions, and that wasn't jumping out to us as far as a need. More outreach, definitely, but specifically the model of embedded librarians, not so much in our chapter.
Sure. And sort of along those lines of outreach, we do have a question here that I think may fit neatly into your wheelhouse, Jennifer, from Lawrence, where Lawrence is saying, I recently recommended to a college librarian that he draw on the diversity of students at his institution to increase the diversity of his workforce. How can library staff encourage student workers to consider careers in libraries? Is that something that you have looked at or have tried to address in any way?
Yeah, we do touch on that, and that's a great point. Both the diversity of our student populations, but also the diversity of our paraprofessional population, or whatever you call them at your institution, both of which are more diverse groups than the professional librarian profession as a whole, and the need for encouraging development of staff, but also of student employees and students at your institution to consider the career of librarianship. And it's going to vary how you do that at your institution, but you can include students more in things like job talks and presentations and professional development activities that you do within the library, invitations to things like brown bags and presentations about conferences, all the sorts of things that you would include a new professional in. It's a good idea to just include your student workers in that so they start getting a broader view of the profession and of the possibilities beyond even what they work for in the department that they work for. And definitely the importance of library leaders encouraging staff within libraries to also take advantage of professional development opportunities, which is not always the case. It's sometimes offered just to professional librarians, and that should be broadened.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Looking through the questions here, we have certainly more than we have time to get to today, but we will get to as many as we can. So we've got one here from Paul who asks, has anyone radically altered collection development to support undergraduate curricula? Given the altered information-seeking behavior by undergraduates, is anyone reducing the number of monographs in favor of periodicals or other sorts of literature? And I don't know if Brian, that would be something that you could speak to, or if someone else would be interested in answering that as well.
I'd be inclined to punt that one to one of the other panelists.
Okay. All right. And
I think that might be one of the people who's not here from a chapter that's not represented.
Yep. So we'll jump down to one last question here. What's that? Go ahead.
Yes. Yes, we're definitely moving in the direction of e-preferred, especially for journals at the big libraries, because everybody's out of space now. That's the biggest consideration.
That makes sense, yeah. Well, we've got maybe one more question real quick here from Ron, who says, I'm wondering how healthy the library publishing role is. We started publishing with OJS in 2004, but have now suspended the service in part due to budget problems. Is library publishing increasing? Are there particularly good business models out there that are maybe specific to libraries? And I think maybe Sarah, is that a question that you would be capable of addressing or interested in trying to take on?
Sure, and I think Brian has chimed in on the Q&A as well, and I'll let him, if he has anything to add to that as well. But I think it's libraries are exploring a number of different business models. Some libraries are generating revenue or are attempting to generate revenue from their publication, but for the vast majority, this remains a fully subsidized activity, and it does need to come from an institutional commitment, and that the subsidies are generally coming from either the library's operating budget. Typically, in some cases, libraries are redirecting money from the collections budget into publishing with the idea that you're, in both cases, facilitating access to published high-quality scholarly content. But I think, effectively, it is, just like many like all library services, it's not going to be something that will necessarily be self-supporting. And I think for most libraries, it's not, and it is, again, subsidized by the library budget. In some instances, it's through being paid for through chargebacks to the departments or the individuals who are publishing. Some libraries are experimenting with whether that is a model that can help support library publishing if they charge, a small fee to the people on whose behalf they're publishing the research, and then grants and others, all of the mainstays of library service funding.
This is Brian here, and I would just second everything that Sarah says, particularly that if we think it's important enough to be able to support and sustain scholarly publishing, especially if it's open access, then it really has to become part of the services that we offer, and that perhaps we're not looking at a business model in terms of how we sustain it, but it really becomes part of our operating budget in a different way. It's the same discussion that goes on in a much larger context of how do we support open access journals and look at ways to, for example, redirect collections funding to those sort of emerging OA journals rather than continuing to sort of spend money in the traditional way with large commercial publishers.
Great, thank you for your responses there. Looking through, we have lots of questions still in the hopper. But we are just a few minutes over the hour right now. So I think I want to respect everybody who's on the line, everybody's time. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, of course, to Todd and to Sari and Carrie, my apologies, and Jennifer and Brian for taking time to present to all of us. It's been a very interesting presentation, I think. I would also remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice with a link to the recording. And we've had a bit of a discussion behind the scenes, and we'll post the slides that we have on our website, so you should be able to find those in the section that's labeled for webinars. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope you all have an excellent afternoon. All right, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. That was great.